As we're getting started, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands in which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This discussion, just to let you know, it is an interactive discussion. So if you are looking to ask a question of our guests, feel free by putting it in the chat function on Zoom. If you're using a screen reader, the keystroke is Alt-H and then type your question in. So I am going to make our guest blush. I'm going to give her a bit of a blurb, but I want to start by thanking, obviously, everybody who's joining us today. Our guest is Professor Margaret Bearman. She is a writer and an academic. Her first novel, Above Water, was published in 2002. She's written for radio, theatre, made award-winning short films. Her recent book, We Were Never Friends, has been heavily downloaded on the Vision Australia audio library and thoroughly enjoyed by our clients. Margaret, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I feel very excited to have this conversation. You know, We Were Never Friends. The launch date of We Were Never Friends was the 11th of March 2020. It was launched in readings in Melbourne. I had many of my close friends and family there. We had a big party. We just started to bump elbows at that point, laughing, you know, and then within a week, the whole of Australia had shut down. And for a book like this, which is, you know, a long time between drinks, between novels, it really would be a browse-through book. The timing was not fabulous in terms of events. So I'm so delighted to be here. I'm not sure how you would like to proceed, Jordan, but what I was thinking was, or what I think we discussed was, that I will talk a little bit about what the book is, maybe do a bit of a reading, and then open up for questions. Is that the...
That sounds awesome. Thank you.
Great. So I struggle with always describing, synopsizing books, and also because some of you may not have read it, so I'm always a little bit tentative to kind of, you know, outline a plot. But in essence, this is a book about the central character is a girl who's on the cusp of adolescence, or sort of what we call turning into the teen years. She is moved from Sydney to Canberra with her celebrated artist father and her family. And in Canberra, she meets another girl. Couldn't really say they were friends. But this girl is very different to Lottie. This girl, Kyla, comes from a low socioeconomic background. She's obviously really struggling, sort of financially, socially, in a whole host of ways. And Kyla's also incredibly smart, and also just a little bit malevolent. So that's kind of the setup for the book. And Kyla comes to stay with Lottie and starts to have her own independent interactions with the rest of Kyla's family, Lottie's family. So that's that, and then the action unfolds from there. So this is the reading is going to come from this very early point where Kyla and Lottie, who now know each other, end up connecting in a sort of more in a stronger way. It took a couple of weeks for Mum to arrange an afternoon off where she could pick me up from school without Luke and Alice. They were a long 2 weeks. I really needed that dress. This is a dress that she's she's going to go shopping for with her mum. Finally, Tuesday came, and after the bell went, I sat on the sun-warmed brick wall by the teacher's car park and waited. The air was hot, dusty, and smelt of eucalyptus. There were long yellowing weeds on the nature strip bending in the wind. Mum had warned me she might be late. I watched cars come and then drive off. Then, just when I thought all the other kids had gone, Kyla Tyler emerged from the front door of the school. She was almost a head shorter than me, spindly, pale as a grub, her head bent on her skinny little neck. You could hear the breath wheeze in and out of her lungs. "What you looking at?" she said, slouching the wall next to me. "Who are you waiting for?" I countered. She shrugged. She wasn't wearing a school hat, and the top of her scalp showed pink through her white blonde hair. "I'm waiting for my mum," I offered, feeling sorry for her. "She's late." Kyla didn't answer. "You feeling sick?" I asked. "Nah." "You been in hospital?" Kyla turned to look at me, and after a moment she spoke. "Yeah, I got a bad heart." "What did they do with you in hospital?" "They check that it's okay," she said. Then she gave a slow little smile. "Maybe I'll die." At that moment, a four-wheel drive pulled up and my mother jumped out, slamming the door, frowning slightly. She stood there for a second on her elegant heels, bare-legged and beautiful. She strode forwards and her stilettos kicked up little swirls of red dust. "Sorry I'm late." "It's okay." I slung my bag over my back. "Oh, but I don't feel so bad. You've had company." She nodded at Kyla, who looked away. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Kyla." "Thanks for hanging out with Lottie." "It's okay." "You waiting for your mum, Kyla?" Kyla shook her head. "Who's going to come and pick you up?" "I'm going to walk home." "We'll give you a lift." "Nah." My mother stared at her for a long moment. "Would you like to come to our house for a while? I can ring your mum from there." I stared at my mother, furious about our forgotten shopping trip. This was behaviour I would expect from my father. Mum made arrangements and stuck to them, almost to the point of being compulsive. "You can go shopping some other time, Lottie," Mum said. "You'd rather play with your friend, I'm sure. Anyway, Kyla looks like she needs to be indoors." Kyla's chest was heaving and she looked really unwell. I thought about her weak heart. "Come on then," I said as graciously as I could. Even though I felt sorry for her, I resented her. We sat in the four-wheel drive together in silence. Panting slightly, Kyla hunched her head over and gazed at her hands folded in her lap. I saw for the first time that she might be pretty. She had a straight little nose and a wide, thin mouth. At home in the kitchen, Mum poured her a glass of milk, which she gulped straight down. "Are you okay?" asked my mother. "Fine," mumbled Kyla. "Would you like a snack?" Kyla shook her head. "Can we turn on the TV?" I asked, pressing the only advantage I had. Mum was strict about how much TV we watched. "Good idea." "Come on, Kyla." I led the way into the small end of the L-shaped lounge room with the TV and the video player. Kyla slumped down on our worn black leather couch. You would have hardly noticed she was there except for that little soft pant of breath in and out. I sat down on the far end. At least I was getting to watch commercial television. I turned it on and flipped excitedly between Funniest Home Videos and Daria. After a while, Mum poked her head in. "Okay, I've got to go and fetch Luke and Alice. I won't be long. You look after Kyla, Lottie." It seemed like a minute before I heard the car turn up the drive and Alice calling out from the street. Luke slouched in, slinging his school bag in the corner. "Why are you watching television?" he demanded. Then he saw Kyla and stared at me in disbelief. "You can turn the television off now, girls," said Mum, lurching a little as Alice tugged at her handbag. "What's Kyla Tyler doing here?" Luke asked. "Who?" shouted Alice, handbag forgotten. Her black curls stuck out in a frizz around her face like the energy radiating from her body. "Does Lottie have a friend?" Kyla sank further into the couch. "She wasn't feeling well," said Mum. "She's got a bad heart," said Luke, slipping to the kitchen. "Everyone knows that." Mum looked at Kyla. Kyla looked at the television. "Let me call your mum and dad," she said. "They must be worried about you, expecting you." Kyla didn't turn her eyes away from the screen. "No one's expecting me." "You're being silly, sweetheart. Just give me a phone number and I'll call." "Don't have one." My mother got onto her knees by the couch. She put her strong brown hand on Kyla's arm. "Come on, sweetheart. Tell me the number." Kyla stared straight past her at the moving images. My mother waited. It must have been a full minute. Then she stood up again in one graceful movement. She gave a little huff of exasperation. "I'll have to call someone," she said. Kyla didn't move. Mum took a deep breath. The principal. Does the principal, she began. Just then the front door banged. Alice squealed with delight. My father appeared and threw into the air and growled as he hugged her. He must have had a good day. Hi, kids, he said, swinging Alice off one hand and grinning. His hazel eyes sparkled. How's tricks, Lottie? In that few seconds, he breathed exhilaration into the room. Even Kyla responded to him. She straightened herself. Who's this then? He asked. This is a friend of Lottie's, said Mum. Kyla. She has a bad heart, screamed Alice, running through the house. Shh, said Mum. Some people think she's a liar, I added. Silence. My family's shocked face staring. I hadn't meant for it to come out mean. Kyla slowly turned towards me. No offence, I mumbled. She stood up. Her skin pinkened and her hands trembled. In one swift and furious movement, she reached down, pulled up a school dress over her head and threw it onto the floor. She stood there defiantly in her underpants and put a shaking figure to the long red scar splitting her bony ribcage. My first thought was, it's true. My second thought, this is really embarrassing. My third thought, she hasn't got breasts yet either. My father said softly, what's that on your back? Kyla looked behind her as if she'd forgotten something. Then she twirled around, almost delicately, like a model swinging on the end of a catwalk. Bruise, she said flatly. A great mass of deep black at the base of the spine, a red circle of split skin the size of a fist. Even Alice was stunned into silence. Who could do that? Asked my father. No one, said Kyla. She struggled back into her school uniform. Oops, I've lost the end here. She struggled back into her school uniform. And that's the end of the piece I wanted to read.
Very good. So I will prompt, I'll try not to do spoilers for the book, but I do have some questions related to the book for the people that have read it, obviously. I wanted to sort of start by asking, so the story starts off with the main character, Lottie, moving homes and schools. And I guess she has that whole seeking acceptance. Why did you want to start the story here?
Well, I think this is a coming-of-age story in many ways. There's a lot of other things. But it's about that moment when you start to find out who you are, both as someone moving into adulthood, but also in that sense of dislocation. And it's also, kind of a weird, love letter's a bit strong, but it's firmly imbued with that idea of moving to Canberra, to the strange place. So that's also that piece that for Lottie, she wants to cut. The story starts with her attempt to start herself afresh, to make her identity new, and all that comes with that. And of course, what she discovers, as we all discover, is that that's not such an easy thing to do, and you bring things with you as well. But that there's some of the reasons that I wanted to start with that. But actually, the very first start of the book is actually that's the start of the action proper. But if you like, the prologue part to the book is where she returns to Canberra as an adult, as a surgeon in training. So it's also that double recycle back to the place that you were.
Yeah,
and locating a place and identity as well.
And having those memories, whether they be good or bad, in that setting. Exactly. When speaking to authors, I often they'll often have these sort of locations where they start things, and they have an association with those locations. Does Canberra have an association with yourself in any way, or is it just?
Sure, I grew up there, so I mean, much earlier than this book is set. But like many good Canberrans, particularly people who grew up in the 70s and 80s, you left never to return because, you know, camera and it couldn't possibly. And about probably quite, when I was in my mid-30s, I really hadn't given Canberra much thought. My parents had left, but I did all of my schooling there. So I was there from age 5 to age 18, quite formative years. I was doing some film reviewing and I was watching a short film that had been set in Canberra. I don't remember the film being particularly outstanding, but I do remember there was a scene of grass. They filmed grass on Mount Jura. I don't know if you know Canberra at all, but you
do,
know,
yeah.
It's got these hills running through the middle. It was Mount Majura. And look, I haven't thought about Mount Majura for years, and they didn't say it was, but I took one look at it and I went, oh, I know where that is. And the grass was swaying, and it was filmed in summer, and I suddenly had this hit of that smell of Canberra in summer, which is a really strong, grassy, hot. And with that came this huge wave of nostalgia. There's no other word for it. I went, oh my goodness. And it made me realise that no matter how far I tried to run away from it, that Canberra was under my skin. And so there's a little bit of this. What I wanted with this book was that sense of childhood and looking back. And for me, that I knew I could bring that to life in a Canberran setting because it's got that quality to me when I think about the place. So I go back to Canberra now. It's different. It's not the same.
Yeah, I get totally where you're coming from.
Yeah.
So obviously Lottie coming to a new school, and she comes with obviously the overarching figure and presence of her father, the painter that everybody knows. And she initially gets taken under the wing of Larissa. Can you tell us a little bit about Larissa?
Well, you know, Larissa is, and I saw this go on. I mean, you know, I remember we all had Larissas if we were, any kid will know the Larissa. Larissa is a popular girl in that sort of hierarchy of girls. Now, often those hierarchies aren't very stable, but Larissa has a pretty firm grip on it. And she's sort of classically Aussie, classically pretty. She's you know, thin and not too strange, shall I say. She's quite ordinary, which is, I think, one of the things about being popular, a little bit charismatic. And I think that one of the things about being those popular kids is that once you become popular, you become very addicted to it. And Larissa certainly feels the need to shore up her position in that schoolgirl hierarchy, I would say.
Yeah, I get where you. So we have a question by Kay previous to this webinar. She sent it through to us. So, in her words, your book reads like a horror story apart from the artistic setting. Would you say this is an insight into teens today? I have a 2 and a 12-year-old granddaughter, and I'm struggling to relate to them. Any advice?
Well, I wrote the teen part of this book looking at my younger children. So when I started writing, I wrote some of those grade 6 conversations when my kids were much younger. And I was sort of extrapolating and also remembering my own experience of them as being quite brutal. I think that children are brutal. I think the problem for today, and this, you know, my children just caught on the end of this, the problem for today, social media has amplified everything. So that brutality has become, and that's not in this book, but I think for the children of today, that is just ever present. And I think that, like the children in this story, and I've had some feedback, people saying, oh, they're too sophisticated. My observation of my children and of some of my friends at that age was there were some kids who were heavily sophisticated. But I do think that children are getting more and more sophisticated, but also less. So in some ways, they know so much more about the world. They know so much more about how to articulate themselves. And they, you know, well, in my experience at any rate, there's a subsection of kids that swear very, you know, they know about things that I just would never have dreamed of knowing at the age of 12. But at the same time, they don't have many of the sort of internal resources to manage all that sophistication. So I think for children today, that's an issue. But I think the horror has always existed. And if you look back at, you know, any classical children outside of literature or horror film, I mean, look at Carrie, for example. They deal with that, or Lord of the Flies. They deal with that issue of children being very, very brutal and cruelly brutal to their own. But I think for me, the horror in this is that the adults don't necessarily, they know they haven't moved on from there. I mean, some adults obviously have. I mean, there's some story arcs here where adults clearly go on and learn, but it's supposed to be a mirror between that brutality of the schoolyard and actually the brutality that is allowed to fester in the adult world from the eyes of the child. So yeah.
It's the changing in the times as well. Like depending on the generations and that sort of thing, there is different methods to display that sort of brutality, as you touched on with social media and things like that. That's a new ever present. I guess parents as well, they seem to have forgotten a lot of what happened when they were younger at times too, and struggle to always associate with some of the things that they're getting told.
But it might not be your experience, and the thing is that I think I think there are some things like you know, children have such voices now that they didn't have. And I know people who are my generation. I was born in 66, so how old am I? I'm 55. You know, I've heard other parents of my generation bemoan we had to be the ones who sat up and were silent and not speak until we were spoken to. But and you know, and our parents, I was never hit, but you know, the corporal punishment was a thing when I was at school, and it's gone now. But you know, and yet we get all this equality from our children, but we never got to experience that. So it's also this sort of difficulty here. But I actually think what I hope the story comes to is some things are really human. People are looking for a space in the world, and sometimes cruelty is a means of finding that space. And I think it's up to adults to look at the bigger picture, not the smaller picture, because the children can't do that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I want to sort of move on to George a bit. Fascinating character. Did you have an inspiration when creating that character in general, or?
Okay, so that's really the inspiration of the book. I mean, his character isn't George. So a couple. I saw one of the pre-asked questions was about George Coates, the artist. That was actually just coincidental. I changed George's surname at the very last minute because the surname that I had, which I think started with an S, I didn't think scanned very well. And I did Google it to check, but I didn't Google carefully enough. And there is a George Coates who is an artist, and a well-known one at that, but not meant to be the same person. And I have a visual for George, and that's slightly based on a real person. But the inspiration was for the full book, and it really stems around George and his relationship to Lottie. I was at a Liberty Victoria fundraiser for some, and they're a sort of an activist group for civil liberties. You know, incredibly important. And they were celebrating a man whose name I have forgotten, which is probably just as well, given the story I'm about to tell. And they were celebrating him and his contribution to civil liberties. And he was, I think he probably was a decade older than my parents. So he was very active and maybe the 40s and the 50s, maybe into the 60s, a very looming figure. And it was a celebration. They'd invited his daughter to speak to him. And she got up in front of there was a lectern. She got up, we were all sitting there listening in a little banquet table things. And she basically said, he was a very difficult man. And I cannot say kind words about him, basically. And she went on to say how difficult and hard he'd been as a father. I believe he was an alcoholic. He had been very, very challenging as a parent. Yet he left this amazing legacy. And so there was this dynamic between the public self and the public good and the real good, not just the public good. It's also the sense that, this man did really good things, yet he was not a good man. And that's something we struggle with, I think, as a society generally. But it seemed to me that struggle was encapsulated in that expression of the daughter, who sort of said, yes, I recognise all this work he's done, but I cannot speak, she would not speak kindly of him. So that was sort of the starting point of the idea between these, the sorts of legacies people leave behind, both the very large legacies, and in the novel it's an artistic legacy, and it's meant to be a genuine artistic legacy. They're meant to be amazing, beautiful, inspirational paintings, and the legacy of himself in the world around him, which is slightly different and slightly more complex.
Yeah, and I guess what I found really quite intriguing about that particular character as well is the level of charisma that seemed to follow most of his passages. But then he seemed to be able, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but he seemed to be able to see things that other people didn't see. So I found that quite interesting as somebody that's able to spot talent. Can you tell us a little bit about the artwork of George's wife and why you put that particular side note in there?
Okay, so that's that. People ask why. So oddly, I don't know if I'm altogether that visual person, but I'm very visual when it comes to writing. So the artworks were there in my mind, and so I described them. That's probably the first reason. But also, I think I wanted him to play with these really complex ideas of motherhood, and I wanted him to see things, as you say, quite clearly. But in order to achieve that seeing, there's a certain brutality to it. There's a certain sort of honesty to it as well. So I think there's that. But I wanted his eye to be one that was about both the visual, the personal, but also the world. So he's an artist who I think has enormous insight into the world that he inhabits. And so in some ways his charisma and insight is never in question. But in this book, almost everyone's moral judgments are, which is and I guess it's a point that that's a slightly different measure of a person.
It's a very, very good message. I like it. So we're at the halfway point of the webinar. So I'll take the opportunity once again to remind people that if they do want to ask a question of Margaret, feel free to pop a question in the chat box. If you are using a screen reader, once again, use the keystroke Alt-H and then type your question in. I'm sure Margaret would love to hear your questions about the book. I might move on in regards to, I'll stay on George for a minute here and just ask, what is it that George really sees in Kyla? Because that's something that in the book, that a lot of people in the book surrounding Kyla don't really see the same thing as George. Can you explain that a little bit to me?
Well, I don't know if I can altogether, but I think one of the things about that is actually Kyla and George understand each other in kind of a fundamental way. So, and he's very visual, so he looks beyond some of the trappings. He can see that she's she holds the same charisma. She holds a deep charisma, and that this is manifested into kind of she's manifested into kind of a malevolent, nasty presence, but it's actually a deep charisma. The other the other connection that I think is there is that they're both characters who will do anything, who don't know their boundaries. Like Kyla doesn't know her boundaries and George doesn't know his. So that also speaks to each other there. They understand that sort of, they're I would say almost ruthless. They're determined, and that they speak to each other. So it's not just George seeing something in Kyla. Kyla responds to George in a different way, partly because she knows that he understands her deeply. That's, at any rate, that's in my mind, that there's an odd similarity.
Now, well, I've got a question here from Namoy. Just going back to your writing techniques, writer's block, quite a common thing that's said amongst authors and people that are speaking to authors. Do you have techniques to overcome writer's block? Do you experience it?
Yeah, I do experience it. I mean, the biggest problem for me at the moment is time. The biggest problem for me with writer's block is often when I have writer's block, the biggest challenge is sometimes it's a sign that the story isn't worth telling or it doesn't want to be told, and sometimes it's just plain writer's block. And I can never tell the difference between the two. So sometimes you can spend a lot of time battling with something and just go, no, I was never meant to be. And sometimes you can battle it and push forward. And there's just this really annoying, like, dead patch in the middle, whether you don't know if you're going to come through the other side or not. For me, time to have writer's block is probably more of an issue for me at the moment than writer's block itself.
So I want to touch on as well that this book seems to skirt and tackle a multitude of messaging. There's a couple of difficult topics to discuss, obviously mentioned throughout the book. When you were planning to write the book, did you intend those messaging to be in there? Were you expecting the reader to walk away at the end of it and go, right, well, this is what I've learned, well, this is the message I got from this book?
What I tend to do in a book, and it's true in this one and it's true in the other one, is I try and not have, I mean, this is the mention I made before of morals is really important. This is a book about morality in many ways. It's a book about making good choices, sometimes under very difficult circumstances, and not making a judgment out whether the choice is a good one or a bad one, but that there are not in terms of that consequential thing, but there's something. The characters are faced with forms of tackling, meeting things that are poor behaviour head on, or moving away from it. Almost every situation kind of revolves around that. So what you've got in the book is a real compare and contrast across different layers of that. And I would leave the reader for themselves to sort of say, well, what do you do? I'm not tremendously moralizing, because I think I'm pretty, I feel like some of the characters in the book that, bad choices are made, or I don't always do the moral thing or the brave thing. But I wanted to have a sense of we can see when it's extremely poor things. And then as it gets closer and closer to the murky zone, how do we keep that clear? So I guess more of a questioning rather than a message.
And it can, well, I'd imagine it'd be quite challenging as well to write when somebody hasn't done something, when one of your characters that you've imbued a little bit of life into does some really morally bad thing. It'd be very hard to write that, I imagine.
Look, yeah, I become pretty grumpy, actually. I mean, it's harrowing rather than hard. It's actually often quite easy to write because in terms of flow, I mean, that's what story's about. It's about generally bad things happen in books. That is kind of there. It's kind of the glue that holds them together. And oddly, very little, it looks like a lot of bad things happen in this. There's really, there are a lot of minor bad things, but works of literary fiction actually tend not to have, if you think of genre fiction, a heap of bad things happen in them, and we don't blink twice at them because they happen all the time. You look at the television, there's more gruesome murders and disembowelments and etc. So this is a world where, I try and make the bad things real. So they're harrowing to write, but they're not difficult. Difficult passages are when you've often when you have to join pieces of action, or you've got this bit of a story going from here to there, and you think, right, that's working and that's working. How do I weave that together? That's much more challenging in terms of writing, but it does put me in a bad mood. I can let it go.
So this is your second book. Did you find it harder to write than your first, or was it just different?
It's the fourth book I've written. The second book I've had published.
Oh, okay.
I've written 4, and 2 got bottom drawed. 1 I think deserved to be bottom drawed. I started to write. I started it before I had children, and then finished it with young children and a whole host of other things. And it just the top of the book is very good, and the back end of the book is not so good. So that got bottom drawed, and I think deservedly so. And I've got a children's book that I wrote, which was the easiest of the 4 to write. I think this book, that there's that. I was looking at something today, saying yesterday for work about does the author make the book, or does the book make the author, sort of thing. And I think this book was easier to write, partly because the bits of it were hard, but partly because I started writing the central story, as I said, between the father and the girl, and then Kyla just popped into the book out of nowhere, and she just took the whole book and ran with it. So I was just chasing her the whole time. So she wrote herself, and that was very easy as a thread to follow once she turned up.
So with your writing, and you've already touched on the fact that you've got a couple of books that you've got in the bottom drawer, and you've explained that some of that might be writer's block, some of that might be just that you weren't happy with it. Do you find like your writing process has evolved whilst you've been writing, or has it remained kind of consistent?
No, it's definitely evolved. I mean, I'm technically a much better writer. I think certainly your work evolves with you. I think when I started and I wanted to write, I was much more idealistic than I am now. I thought that work could do more than it does. Well, that might be being a bit negative. But I'm a little less sorry, I'm just responding to that. I was wondering if the chat was disabled. So it's grown with me. Things have really changed. Having children really altered how I wrote, and being super busy. I used to have these swathes of time when I first started writing where I would float around, and as I said, have writer's block. But now I have to be a lot more tight, and I feel finding time and space, just since post-children, so much harder. They change everything. My children are quite big now. They still change everything.
So obviously you went and you have quite a storied career in academia as well. Did you always want to be a writer?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that well, look, what did I want? I wanted to be what I call an artist, and I don't mean a visual artist. I wanted to work in the arts. So I was interested in being an actor. I was interested in film. I really wanted to direct and make theatre for a while. So I did all of that. And then I loved reading. And I found my greatest pleasure was from reading. I still would love to. I wrote in my bio that I wrote a feature film. I didn't write a feature film that was made. I wrote a feature film script that was optioned and etc. But I would have loved to make and direct a feature film. There's something about writing that gives you complete control over the world. And so I do think that is terrific. I just want to address the fact that the chat isn't working, because I can see it isn't. I can see, if you put a question in the Q&A, I can definitely see it, folks. I can't see the chat either, but I can see the Q&A. It's fixed now.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I was just working away on that while you were answering the question. Yeah, so Gemma has fixed that now.
Because sorry, I still can't. Yeah, no, I can now chat. So that's fantastic. I think that one of the movements in those art forms, though, is that there is something about the world of a book that is just really special. And as I get older, I find myself returning more and more to books again. Maybe it's a question of time. Maybe it's a question of the fact that, we've got all different forms, the electronic books and the audio books and etc. But there's something about the world of a book that is really lovely. And interestingly, I was talking about, when I said I was a visual writer, I actually don't think it's just visual, it's sensory. So there's also the sounds, the smells, the flavors of that world, and those are actually be much more than vision, which you can get in things like film and so on and so forth. But a book, you can get inside someone's skin. But my first book was actually all about smell. You can get into smell, and I think that those sensory experiences, this is the only mode for them. So I do love it.
So did you struggle to get published initially like a lot of other writers, or was that something that sort of came naturally to you? Because we've heard both. I've had some authors that have said, I can't really talk on this because I was published with the first book that I wrote. You go, oh, okay. And then you have some that are incredibly gifted writers that have gone through years and years of manuscripts being sent everywhere and not getting that publishing deal. Did you struggle with that?
I had like a weird sort of mix of those experiences. So I got an agent very quickly, which is difficult. So the wonderful Lynn Tranter is my agent. And then the first book just got a few rejections and we didn't quite know where to go with it. And then it finally was a few rejections, probably about 8 months of rejections, probably 3 or 4. This book was rejected heaps. And what was interesting about it was they were the best rejections I've ever had. I got rejections. I had a few from the books, other books that weren't published. So I know what rejection letters look like. And Lynn always tries to make sure she gets really honest ones. So if someone really hates it, I do know about it. I think one of the most damning ones I ever had was this book. This is one of the books that wasn't published. This book is okay, I guess, but other people just do it so much better. But this book had nice, really super nice rejection books. I loved it. I couldn't put it down. It stayed with me, but I'm not sure how I'm going to publish it. And so this book had a long road of, and Brio's not a big publisher, and now they're with Booktopia. I suspect they'll be bigger. But I had some quite big publishing houses, people say, look, love it. But I don't think that it's, what is it? It's plotted. So is it a crime thriller? Is it a fiction drama? Is it pure literary fiction? It doesn't have a very set genre. And I kind of like that about the book, but it does make it a little bit more difficult to sell.
So I've got a question here from Chris. I'll just read through it.
I think it's a question for you.
I think it is, yeah. Yes, so both books are on the Vision Australia Library, available for you to download and have been downloaded. So, yes, Chris, you can definitely go and find the book, and we'll definitely send a link around with all the information that you will need to remember regarding the name and that information. I'll let Gemma deal with that after the webinar. At this particular point in time, so we're getting to 10 minutes out, and I know that we've had some issues with the chat function, so apologies in advance for that to both our guests and the people looking to submit questions through. Still an opportunity to ask questions if you would like to put them in the chat function, and it actually works now. And you can use keystroke Alt-H if you're using a screen reader. Regarding authors, there are a very small number of blind and low vision authors in comparison to others. Would you have any advice for anyone looking to become published?
Sure, that's an easy answer. Get used to rejection. That's my first piece of advice. I think the key thing I would recommend is to think about what you're trying to do with your writing. So publishing is extraordinarily almost an entirely commercial arts. So the publishing houses in Australia, unlike almost every other form of arts I've worked in, or work it seems like many years ago, film or theatre, ones I've dabbled in, they're subsidised within an inch of their lives by government, and so there should be no complaints, etc. But publishing houses are commercial enterprises. So often to get published, you have to think of who your audience is and where you're trying to move to. So I think you need to be true to yourself. I would never recommend writing just to the audience, but I think you also have to have one eye open for who you're writing for. It might just be for yourself and your friends, and you want to self-publish, and that's absolutely fine. I have some incredibly talented friends who've done that and later on gotten contracts and so forth. But I do think that that's an odd thing, and that it's both a form of artistic expression, but also a commercial enterprise. It's personally something I struggle with, and I want to write the stories I want to write. I'm not tremendously prepared to compromise, but it means that you have to get used to a bit of rejection, and you have to also be clear about what you're trying to do, I think.
So my next question, I think you might have already kind of answered, and I think it might be a combination of both, but the common question that we ask authors usually is, are you a planner or are you a pantser? It sounds a little bit like you did a lot of planning to start the book, and then a character basically took this book from halfway point all the way through, and you kind of just went along for the ride. Is that?
No, I'm a pantser, definitely.
You're a pantser? Okay.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I will start with a premise for a book, and I'll probably have a vague sense, for want of a better word, of the shape of the book. Like, I might have sort of an ending point or whatever. But I wouldn't have I let the story unfold. I don't know what the plot is until I get to the end. Often don't even know what the story is about.
So no daily word counts or anything like that?
Oh, I can do daily word counts, but they're not meaningful. So if I, for example, if I go away on a retreat, which is one of the ways I retreat, by which I mean I block out 4 days and I go somewhere and I lock myself away, I might try and use word count to help me get there, but I wouldn't do I find the discipline of, I find that I need to go into the world, and rather so I need to be driven by the world rather than by the discipline, I suppose.
So I imagine the pandemic has probably affected a little bit of that.
The pandemic was literally a write-off for me, literally a write-off. It was not possible to do anything much. Life slowed right down for me.
So look, your audience started downloading books like crazy during the pandemic. You said that you're an avid reader. What genres do you read predominantly?
Well, it's changed a little bit post-pandemic. I didn't read during the pandemic. I couldn't even read. I did very little during the pandemic. I seemed to cook a lot. That seemed to be my response to the pandemic. I walked a lot and I cooked a lot. And I could only read a little bit later. I don't know. I've returned when I was a child, when I was about the age of the characters in this book, so 12 to 16. I loved fantasy and speculative fiction. And I've kind of had some sort of return to that in recent years. And I've been reading a bit of literary fiction that sort of fits those molds. I recently read Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, Doerr, and I loved it. Thought it was great. So that sort of thing I really like. I notice my attention span seems to be quite short. So I like an easy to read book these days. That's a bit of a post-pandemic thing.
Yeah, I found much the same actually.
Yeah, I wanted to read.
And it's TV as well. I found, attention span, background noise is awesome, but actually remembering anything of the plot at times can be really challenging.
Yeah. It's slowly returning, but it seems to be slower rather than not. And I've sort of returned to what I would call relatively easy reading, which is, not deep, harrowing work at the moment. Although Cloud Cuckoo Land I try and have one sort of literary book on the boil at the same time as well.
So we got to the point in the webinar where we ask what you're working on at the moment. Are you working on another book? You're working on a number of other books. I've heard some people can do that.
No, not me. I'm working on a book and it's slow and I need more time. And I'm about the midway mark. And it's a post-pandemic, right? So I've been working on it since probably for about the end of the last big lockdown, so probably November last year. But I need another bit of clear time to really sort of make some strong headway into it.
So something to look out for, but maybe a little further down the track.
Yeah, look, I really hope, because once you can get through that first draft, then, if I'm disciplined and reserve the time, the rest is straightforward. But that first draft often is like the thing. The pantsing is the problem. It's just getting through.
Look, Margaret, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today. I'm sure our audience absolutely loved it. I will get a flood of questions, I imagine, after the webinar finishes. Am I okay to send those through to you as well? Of
course you are. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I usually do, even when the chat does work, I usually do get a flurry of questions after a webinar, and I'm always very happy to pass them on to our authors. But once again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today.
My absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, all of you. I can see your names out there who took the time to join, so thanks very much.
Vision Australia.
Blindness, low vision, opportunity.
Vision Australia logo. 3 navy blue ovals linked together diagonally within a bright yellow rectangle.